Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's accounting design project. Today we have Bob Resutek from University of Georgia and his co-author, Color Rick, to present distinguishing accrual base from real-based earnings management. Robert, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Young. Yes, those of you tuning in for Joseph's presentation, I'm sorry I had to replace him. He's feeling a bit under the weather, and so I'm going to take his place for this time slot. So we really appreciate the opportunity to present this. We've been presenting it to a couple places recently, getting feedback, and in the process of kind of revising it. And so I think what's been posted is probably 95% of the current version, but there are some slight modifications that might not be in the current version for those of you that read through what was posted. So what we're trying to do, just a general overview. I mean, everyone's, I think, at least on this call, familiar with the earnings management literature. I mean, it's 30 some years long, at least. The general empirical design, the way I think about it is you've got future earnings on the left, and then you've got some sort of agency-based dynamic that's causing firms to manage earnings. And because they manage earnings, their earnings process is different than a normal firm. And so, we use regression-based designs, there's portfolio-based designs, but in general, what we think kind of a overall takeaway, empirical takeaway, is that firms that manage earnings, whether do via accrual-based or real-based metrics, their future earnings are lower. There's a cost to managing earnings, okay? And this is sort of what I mean by this slope A3 is less than zero. So what motivates us to do another study, because there's been more than a few in this area. Obviously, there's strong agency incentives to manage earnings towards benchmarks and targets. We see this, dating back to the 80s. We see this in the executive surveys by Graham Harvey Rajgopal. There seems to be plenty of studies that back this up. So what are we going to add, or why are we motivated to do this? What we would say, there's most of the empirical evidence that's out there. Once you start trying to back out the economic significance or how large the earnings management would need to be to explain the empirical patterns documented, we would say that they seem economically implausible. In the paper we talk about, we reference Ray Ball's Accounting Horizons piece from 2013, where he basically says like this might be one of the most incorrect inferences in all of accounting research, or in so many words, things are misplaced. So we want to see if we can kind of reconcile the two views. I mean, this idea that I think most people would admit earnings management likely exists, probably exists, but our empirical evidence that we offered as academics is lacking sometimes. We also note, and again, I think we say this loosely because I think this holds in general, but maybe not in every single case. There's been very limited work on the differential effects of joint earnings management. Again, I think the Graham Harvey Rajgopal surveys talk about, firms using both, but we would assert that the vast majority of empirical studies focus on one or the other. And I'll get into a bit more of sort of the limitations of that in subsequent slides. The last thing we just want to note is I would say there's limited work on quantifying what these real costs of real earnings management are. I mean, if you think back to workshops you've been in, people often just use this term real as if it's supposed to mean something. But as academics, I kind of think one of our job is to what do we mean by real? Define these things. In the accrual literature, these things are defined with respect to reversals and how they mechanically affect future earnings. But I would assert that on the real earnings management side of the literature, these costs are not definitively defined. They're sort of defined loosely. And so what we want to try to do is examine both within a joint research design that has consistent assumptions between the two and try to provide a mechanism for more intuitive discussions of just economic plausibility of earnings management. And so hopefully I'll get to it. I think I will, kind of the way we're thinking about this via reduced form design. And sort of the goal would be if this design at least has some legs, maybe the questions, the debates we have in workshops and in papers is, given the patterns that we see, is this economically plausible? Does it seem reasonable that we could explain the patterns via earnings management, or are we, is the economic plausibility just not there? All right, so contributions, I think we've got a new empirical design. It's sort of a reduced form setup. What we've tried to make a concerted effort in doing is setting up these regressions in a way that dovetails into the general design used in the literature over the last 30 years. Simple univariate regressions or simple OLS designs where we can map findings in from prior studies into our design, and we don't need to make heroic assumptions. It's just, for lack of a better term, sort of a simple OLS setup. We think we offer mechanisms. We've got two mechanisms that sort of define what we mean by, or what we think the literature might mean by, the real cost of real earnings management. And again, we can debate and discuss these on the call when I get to those, but we kind of think this is at least a stake in the ground in terms of how to think about real earnings management, the costs of real earnings management. We offer new tests. One of the advantages, I think, of our design is that it's not restricted to a single time period. Like, I think we make mention in the paper, the vast majority of empirical studies look at earnings management over annual horizons, but when the survey literature and the popular press talk about earnings management, they typically, I think, are referring to earnings management over quarterly settings. And quarterly settings for earnings management typically is more difficult because of the seasonality. And I think our design allows us to kind of sidestep some of those seasonality issues. And then we think we offer some new evidence in a way that we can explain some of the findings we find and sort of maybe reconcile the general findings in the empirical literature to Ray Ball's concern that what we see, if we try to infer economic plausibility, he would say, like, that's the evidence is the evidence of earnings management doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint. We think we can reconcile these two views. All right, so real quick, just sort of summarizing the accrual and the real earnings management literature. We kind of think of the accrual management literature as kind of being comprised of three subsets. The vast majority use some sort of Jones type model. So we're all familiar with these, kind of assume the accrual process is linear in form, either at the firm level, industry level, time, blah, blah, blah. And what we do is we link unexplained accrual variation to some sort of agency friction and future earnings. And what we, as the Academy, would assert is this is consistent with earnings management. And obviously the limitations of these models is well documented in the literature. There's a smaller set of studies, what we'll refer to as sort of reduced form. And so these typically follow kind of like, you assume earnings follow a simple statistical process. And then what we as academics try to do is try to explain differential earnings persistence via recovered earnings management parameters. And so, I think the Chow-Tchev 02 could be viewed as a reduced form model, especially if you think of that Appendix B where they do their simulations, where they basically assume earnings or accruals follow a simple process and should have the same persistence as cash flows, but for estimation error. And that estimation error is assumed to reverse over a single period. And there's been other papers. Joseph has one with Andre. Patty DeChow has one with Chad Larson, where they assume can we explain earnings management if accruals and cash flows have differential persistence? So under the idea that asset impairments are likely to have different earnings persistence than stock-based compensation. So if we let that vary, can we explain some of the patterns we see in earnings with earnings estimation error? So what I would assert is these reduced form models tend to be a bit less restrictive than maybe some, or require a fewer heroic empirical assumptions than maybe the Jones style models. And then we have more recently some of the structural estimation papers. These models sort of assume everything operates in general equilibrium. We have to make some pretty strong assumptions, but if some of these assumptions hold, which we use economic theory to ground these assumptions, can we what we back out, the implied earnings management, are they reasonable? And obviously each of these three sets of literatures have advantages and disadvantages. But I think this is sort of useful just to note, especially this top bullet point. I would assert this is probably 99% of the studies out there, and probably 99.9% of the sites. The real earnings management literature. So I think what we assert in the papers, these have largely evolved in parallel. So the real earnings management literature and the accrual management literature has largely evolved in parallel over the last 20 or so years. Again, they generally use this Chowdhury type OLS-based model where we assume discretionary expenditures, productions, cash flows are linear and some sort of control variables. And then whatever we can't explain, that sort of residual is then linked to agency frictions in some form of earnings. And we use these associations as evidence of real earnings management. Okay, so very similar to what we see with the first set of accrual-based studies. Now, I would assert, and I'm happy to open this up if people think we're wrong here, but there's very limited, and I would almost assert zero studies out there on reduced form or structural REM models. Okay, so if someone was to ask, okay, what are these real costs of real earnings management? How do these real costs affect future earnings? Does it lead to higher future expenses, lower sales, over what time period? I would assert there's been pretty much what people might say is yes, but there's really no evidence. There's really no sort of form for how this works. Now compare that to kind of maybe what Richard Sloan and some others have done with respect to accruals. We know that accrual errors, we make these assumptions, they need to reverse into future earnings. And Richard and some of his co-authors and other co-author groups have papers that build on this idea. Accrual errors need to reverse. They have to reverse into the accrual component of future earnings. And there's some structure behind that. We would assert there's very limited structure, if not no structure, with respect to real earnings management. Okay, and so we kind of find this to be puzzling and something that we want to contribute to with this paper. Because ultimately we want to get to this idea that the patterns we see in the data that we're using as academics to, whether we want to say prove or what have you, that earnings management exists, are they economically plausible? And without some sort of structure around that, we kind of have these loose ideas. And when push comes to shove in the workshop or the review process, we kind of have to sort of like we've got pretty much nothing to lean on because those papers don't exist. All right, so sort of to summarize kind of our motivation. Majority of the empirical earnings management studies, I'm going to say, require sort of this forgiving view of earnings management constructs. And I think what we're getting at there is, that's well documented. These arguments or discussions often happen in workshop. How should we model the accrual process? And there's been a lot of work done over the last 25 to 30 years of thinking of additional improvements to these linear accrual models. And Ed Owens and Joanna have a paper, I guess it's almost 10 years old now, that kind of highlight how these models tend to fail, okay, because of business shocks, heterogeneity in business models, et cetera, et cetera. But what we assert in this paper is, even if you assume these models work, these linear models are correct in expectation, they still are going to estimate the accrual process with imprecision. Okay, and this is a point that Brewer and Schrute bring out in their 2023 RAS piece. I mean, this is perhaps one of my favorite papers, if not my favorite paper over the last couple of years that I read. So I think they do a really nice job kind of conveying how estimation uncertainty affects our inferences. And I think typically we kind of wave our hands at this or kind of look the other way. But they do a really nice job highlighting that the estimation imprecision in these models can drive significant results. Okay, so this is something important. This is, they provide a way to sidestep this or to address this. But this is sort of an important issue that we need to confront as academics. And I think our study provides another way to kind of sidestep this idea or this friction that comes up when we estimate these OLS models with imprecision.
Whenever you have time, Sudipta has his hands up.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Sudipta, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. If someone wants, yeah, fire away.
So, in terms of the patterns in the accruals, doesn't this depend a lot on how long the attempt to manage earnings goes on? So, if you think about channel stuffing in the real earnings management literature, you could stuff the channel 1 year, but then next year when it reverses, you might re-up and stuff it a little bit more. And so
Yeah.
you could have these
Agreed.
patterns. So
I agree. And if you give me a couple slides, I'll get to that very point, and then you can hammer me at that point, or we can go back and forth. But yeah, no, this is an important point that we've given some thought to, because yeah, it does come up, and it is possible. All right. So the second point I think that's important. Typically, these models of accrual-based earnings management or real management are estimated independently. Okay, so think of a typical real earnings management regression. Let's just say SG&A is on the left, and we try to explain the SG&A process via controls on the right. Okay, so a question could be, and we haven't really seen this fleshed out in the literature. SG&A is going to be comprised of accrual and cash components. So is this residual? Is this residual that we use to proxy for real earnings management? Could that not also be capturing accrual-based earnings management? This is basically what we're trying to do is explain the SG&A process, but unexplained variation to the extent SG&A contains both cash and accrual components. That residual is going to contain cash and accrual components. So how do we think about that as academics? The accrual models aren't or we would assert they're not immune to this criticism either. So if we think of the typical accrual model, say change in working capital is on the left, and we explain this with whatever, sales and other control variables, and then we have this residual. Going back to Sudiptu's point, let's just say the firm is stuffing their channels. So they're doing some sort of real earnings management where they're selling stuff on account. They're accelerating their sales, maybe via price discounts. If some of those accelerated sales manifest and are recognized via accounts receivable, that's going to show up in this accrual-based measure. So is that residual? Is that residual capturing real, or is it capturing accrual? We would assert that the literature is kind of silent on this point. I think this is sort of an important point because we can't, how can we say one over the other when it's quite possible our measures are capturing a little bit of both? Assessments and discussions of economic plausibility are difficult. Again, these are estimated on, independently. The few papers that have looked at this stuff, where firms are using both at the same time. How do we measure, since they're estimated independently, the total implied managerial discretion, so if you're to try to back out, how much discretion do these firms have on average that are managing earnings via real methods or via accrual measures? At best, we're going to sum up those two things, but this seems sort of, at least in our view, sort of unsatisfying because we typically think of, managers having levers, and they can't just pull both levers full bore to go about managing earnings. And so, it'd be nice if we had a way to kind of quantify these things collectively. And so, this is, again, sort of a shortcoming that we're going to try to address with our model. Finally, we would say like the prior models typically don't use these closed form accounting identities to our advantage. And so I think this is what attracted many of us to accounting, is sort of these formulas, right? And so if we think of this top formula, typically we have some sort of earnings management variable on the right-hand side. There's a relation with future earnings, control for everything we can on the right. We say, look, this significant A1 slope is consistent with accrual-based earnings management. It's consistent with real earnings management. Well, since net income is a function of cash flows and accruals, we can break these things out. Since net income is a function of sales growth and expense growth, we can break these things out and perhaps make more precise inferences. If it's accrual-based earnings management, yes, future earnings should be lower, should be less persistent, but that lower persistence should come through with the accrual component of earnings. You know, if we're seeing it with the cash component of earnings and the cash component of earnings only, that's not necessarily, we would say that's not consistent with accrual-based earnings management. Okay, and so what we want to try to do collectively is kind of, these are some of the shortcomings, and we don't want to hammer the prior studies. We just kind of want to acknowledge these exist and kind of use these shortcomings as motivation for kind of what we're doing in this study.
So if I can jump in again.
Yes, go ahead.
So you're assuming that these linear models actually make sense. But from Raybaugh's perspective, if you think about what's the economic null hypothesis, for accruals, we've known since my dissertation 30 years ago that accruals don't operate symmetrically, that the impairments tend to behave differently than the rest of the accruals. So you've got to treat negative accruals differently than positive accruals, sort of in really short. And then on the cost side, on the real earnings management side, we have this phenomenon of cost stickiness, which we've also known for about 25 years now, where when there's sort of a reduction in sales, costs don't drop proportionately. You tend to conserve resources because it's costly to adjust them. So if you've got misspecification in both your real earnings management and your accrual earnings management models, which you've known about for 30 years, how can you draw any inferences?
Okay, so maybe let me hit these one at a time. So we are not asserting that these are the best models or that these are well specified. What I'm trying to do in this slide and in the study is just note, like, this is sort of the modal way that people have used and continue to use to define this earnings management. But I think, yeah, Ray's point in this 2013 paper, the Ed Owens and Joanna and Jerry Zimmerman's paper, they kind of pointed out as well. So point taken. I mean, I think you and I agree on that. With respect to sort of the asymmetric relation between accrual management, between positive and negative accruals, and cost stickiness, agreed. This is one of the issues we run into when you're attacking when you're looking at a mature literature, is there's a million different variants on that. I think for purposes of this study, we're taking more of Richard Sloan's perspective of just thinking of, if there's an error in accruals, whether it's positive or negative, it's going to reverse into the next period component of future earnings. This would be similar to DeChow and DeChev and similar to Allen Larson Sloan.
All of these models assume linearity, and when you run the data, they all turn out that there's a significant non-linearity.
So what I would say then to this non-linearity idea and maybe your cost stickiness is, I think, to the extent we can set that issue aside, or at least on the back burner for now, our model would allow this non-linearity to be tested. I think our model is going to be flexible enough that you're going to be able to layer in that asymmetric accrual reversals. You can layer in cost stickiness if you want, if that's something that researchers want to look at down the road. I mean, because these are legitimate points. I get what you're saying with respect to, we're assuming that positive errors reverse just assume the same as negative errors. And we do take the point, I think we note this in the paper, and we think of like bad debt expense. So I think that would be sort of the typical view in the literature. Now, granted, there's asset impairments and things of that nature that are going to reverse asymmetrically, and that's something I think our model could be adjusted to address, but perhaps not in this paper by itself, because we feel like we we almost have too much going on as it is. But your point's well taken.
Can
I
I
think
add
I'm going
something
to
to
punt
to
a
the
bit on it,
linearity?
and that we can't address all of it at once.
Can I add something to the linearity discussion? I don't really understand why we're going after linearity first. In macroeconomics, log linearized models are used all the time. And before we argue that we have a better nonlinear, then it needs to be stated and show that it performs better. Because, when you have variation across a steady state, it's not clear that by having more variables that are also linear, for example, things that are time series driven, you wouldn't do an equally good job just with linear models. So I'm not against nonlinearities, but they have there is a proof to be made here that we gain from making the model ever more complex. So to me, I mean, it's not clear that why are we going after that as the first thing?
So just to clarify, are you saying why are we attacking these linear models, or why are we dismissing them?
I think this is fine, but before we have the economic issues being really and have a if you want to make a better nonlinear model, which you're not doing, but suppose someone went after, they need to provide a better nonlinear models. We can't evaluate linear models against nothing. It would
Well,
need to be formally
Shivakuma did this
stated.
in 2006. They have a paper comparing it to Dichav and Jones and show that they do much better.
Better in what sense?
Explanatory part.
How is that explaining something we haven't really observed? Does that predict misstatements? Is it a structural model that shows you have a better fit to the actual? I mean, I'm not sure we even have a good diagnostic for those models. So I think here we have to be reasonable and start simple of model we understand rather than stacking in millions of different nonlinearities and then we don't know anymore what we're doing.
Yes, I acknowledge your points, Adiptu, and I think I actually had something in this at one point, just kind of like a caveat or disclaimer, like we're not saying this, our idea is a panacea and it's going to solve everything. It's just more of a let's shift our view and try to, I mean, kind of, I think one of the primary contributions here would be let's think of earnings management as a collective strategy where they've got two levers and that we can kind of assess both collectively. I mean, your points are taken, and maybe this paper goes anywhere, the people can start to address, errors in asset impairments versus errors in bad debt expense. Steve, I see your hand.
Yeah, I guess to Jeremy's point, we're actually going deeper. The idea that these things follow an assumed process, linear or non-linear, I don't think it works like that. Okay, that the whole thing can be parameterized. Some years firms drop R&D, sometimes they increase R&D, sometimes they drop advertising, they increase advertising. There's shocks, demand shock, there's supply shocks. In a particular period, to parameterize that doesn't seem to make much sense to me. It's not the world. Now, businesses and accounting is not generated by a process, an assumed process. The other thing is a lot of these models, I've said this before on the ADP, these Jones models and DeChow and Chev, there's no validation of the model. They're just by fiat. At one time, I went through and took these models and I looked at the epsilons in these models. And I went and looked at the 10Qs and the 10Ks. If it's a high epsilon, can I see it? No, I can't see it. And if you can't see it in the financial statements, you can't see it. Now, if in fact it's represented by a really odd increase in accounts receivable and so on, it's suspect. So the diagnostics we teach in class about quality, I don't think these models pick them up. They've never been validated, let alone what are the type 1 and the type 2 errors. When you apply the models, the whole thing's a mess in my view.
I think we're all on the same page with respect to these linear models. And so I think the point of this slide was just to kind of highlight, there are, I mean, even if you were to assume they're correct, there's still issues with them, whether, you're capturing accrual or real, or whether you got this parameter uncertainty. So, yeah, and I'd like to move on from this, but I think we're all on the same page. Well, most of us, at least, with respect to the limitations of these linear models. But I think it's also worth noting they still end up in print. They still we have these discussions, but they still end up in print, perhaps because the Academy hasn't come up with something, an alternative. that
No,
people are
I call
coming
that
from.
the academic chain letter. We just write these, we assume this each other and we just carry on. Okay.
Do it like last year, exactly like last year. That's just like auditors do. All right. So we have these limitations. Can we advance? Can we advance this? And so this is sort of what I wanna get at. I wanna kind of show how Joseph and Colin and I kind of use some of these accounting identities to build up a way to think about earnings management collectively. So that a simple overview of the model. So, and again, I know we've got to start from somewhere. So we're just going to start with a simple univariate regression. And so what this first bullet point is just conveying is like, look, let's just assume there's no earnings management. Okay. Everything's perfect. Okay. Managers operate and they make the correct operating decision and they make the correct estimations. Okay, so in that case, B1 is sort of the earnings persistence, and we think about this. This is sort of where we go for, but we know it, that doesn't hold. So this is sort of what I'm getting at with in imperfect settings. We know that B1 prime is less than B1. Okay, and that's sort of what's going on here, and this is sort of where our model adds to it. We say, look, there's this. I'm going to use this word loosely. Don't hang me because of it. We've got this perfect process that we can't observe, but we know exists. Okay. And then we have this error process. Okay. And this error process is a function of the earnings management strategies that managers use and then sort of how these are parameterized. And so this is sort of the contribution. This is sort of what I want to, it'll be interesting to us to hear your feedback on it. This sort of this right-hand side represents sort of the earnings management process. And what we're going to try to do is, back to this initial formula or initial equation, if you will, A3 is different than A1 because of this sort of error appendage, if you will, sort of the effect on future earnings, the effect on future accruals, cash flow, sales, driven because of this earnings management. So this is sort of what we're going to try to map out in the subsequent slides. Steve.
Yeah, I'm not sure why you start with predicting future earnings without any other accounting information. If you add book value there, it'll show you very clearly that if the book value has high relative earnings, particularly if it's abnormally high, earnings will be lower in the future. Okay. There's a lot of other information that's not built in here.
So this is obviously the way we apply these things and as archivalists is these are scaled. But one of the things we're working on now, just to prove it to ourselves, Colin and I are having this discussion right now, is I think this model will work if you put control variables in. Okay. I think if you do, because really what we ultimately are doing is testing for the incremental earnings management. So we've got control and we have suspect firms, and sort of the way our model, which we would assert the vast majority of empirical models do, is like we have control variables in there. So we're testing for the incremental earnings management. So I think this model, what we're going to lay out, if you wanted to put additional control variables to the right of net income up top, you could, and our model would still work. Paul?
Yeah, just you went back to the Owens, Wu, and Zimmerman paper. Unless you really had just an incredible insight into what all the controls could be, how would you really know that there isn't some kind of underlying shock that's driving your next period's earnings as opposed to earnings management? It seems like it's just going to be so hard to really know.
Agreed. And so I maybe I wasn't clear here. Like I'm using the Owens paper sort of if you will, backup or ammunition for why these linear models fail or are going to be weak tests of earnings management. That paper still, you might still say, well, the model you're going to suggest still has those concerns with business shocks, and I agree. I think it's a different form, and I would say it's a weaker effect. So if I get to the next slide or two, let me know if you still have this concern. But in general, that the previous slide I went through, all we were trying to convey is that there are problems with these prior papers, and even if Ed Owens and co-authors were wrong, and these models were perfect. There are still flaws in the models that affect how we make these earnings management inferences. But Paul, your point on business shocks, I think could still affect our results, and we try to be transparent in terms of how it will. All right, so this will perhaps get to Paul's point. We kind of have a two-step model. The kind of way to think about this would be, all right, the first step is gonna be to identify these suspect firms that are managing earnings, okay? And then some sort of control sample, all right? And when we get to the results, maybe earlier you can beat me in terms of how we do this, but part of what we're trying to do is to tie into the prior literature. But the general idea that we're basing this off of is that the earnings management firms, the suspect firms, are the exact same as the control firms, but for this earnings management. So Paul, to your point, it's true. If you had a sample of control firms and you're going to say, well, they're fundamentally different than the suspect firms, even after your controls, our model isn't going to be able to address that. But I would say that that's true for any study out there. Okay, but kind of the primary thing, one of the fundamental assumptions that goes into our design is that the suspect firms and the control firms are the exact same, more or less, but for this earnings management that we as researchers think goes on. Okay, once you set that up, we then are going to we then have this process that makes the suspect firms different than the control firms, and this is what I'll call this error appendage. This is the effect on future earnings and the components of future earnings driven by accrual and real earnings management. And so, Young, I see your hand. Let me just address this and then I'll get to your question. So we have these 4 parameters, okay, that are going to affect how future earnings and earnings components evolve. This lambda parameter is something that we calibrate and we say this is, either all real, all accrual, or some sort of combination of the two. Okay, so if you will, firms can pull one lever, can pull the other lever, or can kind of pull them both together. We have this gamma parameter, which we are going to assert. This is sort of the cost of real earnings management. If you will, you can think of this as sort of the revenue multiplier. And so real briefly, if a firm cuts R&D, the assumption needs to be that affects future sales to some extent. If there's not some sort of effect on future sales, then we would say that that's not really real earnings management. There needs to be the cost. And so our real cost is going to be parameterized by this gamma parameter. Sigma E, this is just the magnitude of the earnings management, like how big is it? And we parameterize that with a volatility. And then nu, this is just the type of real earnings management. So as I'll get to in the next slide, we kind of think of real earnings management as there's 2 types of strategy that you can think managers do. So maybe I'll stop there. Young, I'll get to your question.
So Bob, I wondered that instead of using the suspect firm, can you use like some restated firms or AER firms that expose that during what period, what type of the real earnings management or a core earnings management actually they had? I think that the discussion you had with other participants earlier is that how do we evaluate that what you proposed here is actually superior? That's if none of us actually have the truth, right? The underlying truth, but you can take advantage of some of those restatements or accounting fraudulent irregularity events exposed. We knew actually what happened in the historical period as a validation to kind of like fine tune all those parameters you have in the model.
So we could, and this is something we've debated. Part of what the debate centers on is what empirical settings are most unequivocal and easiest to examine, that people are not going to have debates over. And so, going back to Richard Sloan's work, I would assert there's nothing equivalent to the accrual anomaly, where you regress future earnings on accruals and net income, and you pretty much get the same slope. If you regress future returns on accruals, you get the same slope. The earnings management studies out there largely are, there's so many research design variants that it's difficult. And so this is part of why we chose what we did. With respect to the AAERs, I was talking to Chad Larson last week about this because he kind of did that study with Patty and he did a lot of the collection. And this might be a question for you or some of the participants here. What he was saying was that many of the AAERs were just outright fraud. So this would be firms that just we're going to recognize revenue. We're going to extend the fiscal year an extra week. We are going to just recognize revenue completely improperly. And so it's not clear to us, Chad, Joseph, and I, whether that's really earnings management, because that's not really within if those firms would have told their auditors, yeah, we just decided to open up our revenue recognition window an extra week, they would not allow that. We typically think of earnings management as within that discretionary range that managers have discretion to do this. And so, are these AAERs, would you view this as true earnings management if it ends up being fraud?
But can you use financial restatements or accounting estimate changes? Because earnings management for the real accrual is some sort of the term we're creating in our field with some managerial intent. But what we can actually see as an archival researcher is some of the events that company go back and then correct it or changes the estimates they have in the past, with or without intent, right? We cannot validate it unless we are in the court to actually see whether they intentionally changing those estimates or misreporting later on triggers the restatements. But I think those are a lot more higher frequency events.
We can, and I will
AAER.
say I'm not as familiar with how that stuff stacks up empirically, and maybe afterwards, or I can shoot you an email and you can point me to some of these studies. That would be great. Okay, so we've got these parameters, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create these if you will, synthetic slopes. Okay, and so here's our formula for the slope coefficients of firms that we think manage earnings, these suspect firms. Okay, and so what we're going to refer to these as sort of synthetic slopes. We're going to construct those as the sum of the earnings processes of the control firms. Because remember, one of the fundamental assumptions we rest on is that the control firms are the exact same, more or less, to the suspect firms, but for this, what we suspect is earnings management. So we're going to use the covariances and variances from the control firms to build up the left-hand side of this equation. Okay. The right-hand side, this element here, this is going to be the error process. Okay. And this error process is a function of these Greek letters. Okay. And this is going to yield what we call as a synthetic slope. And then we're going to compare these synthetic slopes to the observed slopes, what we observe as archivalists. And if, across these different regression platforms, if we cannot statistically distinguish the observed slopes from the synthetic slopes, via the standard error structure, we're going to assert this is evidence consistent with earnings management. But as we show, there's several more layers of necessary conditions that must hold for us to be able to show earnings management compared to what prior studies have. Okay, so basically this is what we're doing. We're using the control firms to set up what the slopes would look like. And again, we're doing this for not only net income, but also the slopes for future sales, expenses, cash flows, and accruals. Okay. Maybe the last part, because I think this would be good to hear your feedback on, and then we'll get into some results. Accrual-based earnings management. So everything we do is based upon a reversal. Okay, and so I know that this was brought up earlier about reversals over multiple periods, and we can get to that. We assume, for purposes of this model, that accrual errors reverse in the next period. So this is sort of for mathematical simplicity. We could build in an autoregressive process if need be. But we don't think that would matter a whole lot. But the general idea here with accrual-based earnings management is that managers are adjusting the timing of earnings recognition, but they're not affecting the underlying earnings generating process of the firm. So they're just shifting timing. Okay. But this error, this this accrual-based earnings management action must reverse. You underestimate bad debt expense in the current period. The next period, there needs to be higher bad debt expense or write-offs, and that's going to lead to lower future earnings. So there's a reversal. Okay. How does that compare to real-based management? So we've got two flavors of real-based management. First one we call permanent. Okay. And so this is a 2-period effect. And this is where managers are going to cut, let's just say they cut SG&A or they cut advertising expense in period T. And what we're assuming is that's going to affect the earnings generating process of the firm going forward. So because they cut advertising suboptimally, they should invest $8, they only invest $6. We assume there must be a cost to this, a real cost. And this real cost is going to be lower future sales. Okay, because we assume firms are operating optimally, that cost must be greater than what they cut. So if they cut $2 of advertising, future sales must be lower, must be $2, more than $2 lower in the future.
So we observe empirically that firms cut advertising during recessions. Would you claim that that is not optimal?
No, I'm saying that can be perfectly fine. We need to have a reversal. So
Would that be earnings management or just good management? Why is it earnings
good management? So what we're trying to get at is, remember, it's going to be a comparison between what the control firms do and the suspect firms. So if the control firms are cutting advertising, presumably the suspect firms will be doing the same because that's the optimal thing they should do. Okay, but if they cut advertising and it doesn't reverse in the future, then you're right. That's just good operations. And I think this is sort of a key thing that we're noting is that typically what we see in the literature is firms, people look at settings where managers have, they perhaps realize the negative shock, and maybe it's optimal for them to cut discretionary expenditures. So maybe it isn't real earnings management. What we require in our study is that if it's real earnings management, we must see evidence of reversal. And at least in this setting, it must be lower future sales. Okay. And then in the future, at least in this simple setting, advertising in the next period just bounces back. Should have been $8. It was $6 in the current period. The next period, it bounces back up to $8 and whatever. So it's just a reversion. It's not a reversal. Okay. So that's a key distinction. And what we say is if that's what's going on, this is going to affect future sales and future cash flows. There should not be an effect to future expenses or future accruals. Okay,
but Robert, if you have advertising, you don't have advertising campaign and it doesn't pay off, you're not going to get future sales, right? If you do R&D, most of it doesn't pay off, you're not going to get the future sales. So it's not as if certainty you get advertising or R&D, you're going to get future sales.
But in expectation, that's true, right? In expectation, the reason you're doing advertising because you expect higher future sales.
Well, you have heck of a lot of variance around it.
You do have a heck of a lot of variance around it. I think this is sort of this is implicit in the models that we've been using. And again, what we're trying to say is relative to the control firms, these cuts in advertising lead to lower future sales. And it's just sort of comparing these things. And if we don't see evidence of it, if it's like, look, we don't see lower future sales, then what we would assert is in that setting of suspect firms, they're not, the cuts of advertising are not real earnings management. There needs to be a differential. There needs to be this bounce back like we see with accruals. Otherwise, it's just good operating decisions, or we can't distinguish good operating decisions from what we see. And this is sort of a critical part, and this maybe gets to Paul's point. The setup, the comparison between the control and the suspect firms is important, but it's been important for 30 some years. We're just kind of, emphasizing the importance of it with our design. Peter, I see your hand up.
Hey, thanks. Really interesting. I'm trying to get my head around the sort of the econometrics. So if you go back to your equation 10, so you talk about the additivity of the slope coefficients, which is fine.
Yes.
The intercepts also add up.
Right.
But you seem to be ignoring the intercepts entirely. So then when you get to modeling the real earnings management, accruals-based earnings management, all the action is coming through the slope coefficient that you're modeling. So have you guys thought about what you need to assume about the intercepts effectively, or the other parameters that determine the slope coefficients? It
So I
seems like
agree.
something else could be giving here.
I mean, it's a good point, Peter, with respect to the intercepts, and I would agree. We don't really give that much attention. And I think part of this is because the collective literature hasn't given it much attention. And
Well,
so
I mean, it's in the residual, right? I mean, it's part of the calculation of the residual. But
the
if there is a
the intercept
difference
is the
in
change in
the
the intercept. Okay.
yeah, because the residual is the y minus the y hat, right? So, which includes the intercept.
We can think about that. I mean, I will say I haven't given it much thought because I'm kind of thinking, and I think collectively we think about this with respect to how the literature's looked at it. We probably, I mean, we can discuss, and maybe we need to look at the intercepts to see if these things drop as well. I think often they do. So what you will see is that suspect firms have lower future earnings. That intercept is negative, that A2 from my earlier slides, but that would be consistent with the firms, realizing a negative shock. And so we would expect intercepts to be lower. But I think for it to be earnings management, we're saying that the future earnings are lower because managers did something in period T to negatively affect the earnings generating process going forward. So we can look at these intercepts to see if they jive. I think they do, but I probably need to look at them more carefully before I can opine on
Sorry,
that.
that might have been a digression, but anyway,
It's,
thanks.
it's all good.
So,
All right. The last
so
point
going
we want
back
to
to your
make is
advertising example, what if firms can substitute between actions to change their sales? So think about marketing, which isn't included in advertising. Think about price discounts. Think about a whole lot of other choices that managers have, and maybe different actions are more valuable in recessions versus booms. So then you would sort of focus on just one of the actions and sort of use that as a measure or instrument for earnings management, but really all they're doing is shifting dollars from one category of sales boosting to another category.
So I mean, we can't control for everything, but let me just say if you're saying if they're doing a little bit of both, like if they're accelerating sales via price discounts, we're going to show that that's going to show up that's just going to be fleshed out in our empirical design as real earnings management. If they are boosting,
Again, is this optimal management versus earnings management?
that's for the researcher to decide because if there isn't a real cost, if we don't see a drop in future sales, then we would say like we can't rule this out as being optimal. There needs to be some sort of reversal because otherwise, as archivalists, we're just, you can't distinguish one from the other. Is sort of what we're saying. So, I mean, what you're saying is managers are making decisions all the time. I think as academic accountants, we need to say like, are these decisions really, agency driven by agency incentives that are suboptimal for the firm? Well, if so, then there needs to be the actions they take in period T must affect the earnings generating process in T+1, not just, be correlated with lower future earnings. I think that's
They're
sort of the
not
key with
modeling the
earnings
agency
management.
incentives at all, so we can never tell from this model.
I don't think that's true, because I think what we're going to flesh out is there's some agency incentive as we'll see with if we get there. Maybe I can jump ahead a bit. A meter beat incentive, and then we can say these are consistent with our model and with these 5 slope parameters that we set up. It could be that maybe these were optimal, but we can't rule out earnings management. And I think that's sort of the way we do literature in general. Like we can't rule out mispricing, but given this model, we can't. It's also consistent with risk. There's always going to be a joint hypothesis, I think, when we do these cross-sectional studies. All right, so I've got 5 minutes. I do want to jump ahead maybe to one set of results just to kind of show you how we're thinking this works. The only thing with this other set of earnings management, real earnings management, there's an effect on future sales, but then what we're saying also is that whatever expense they cut must reverse in the future. Okay, so if they cut advertising in T plus in year T, whatever they cut, that needs to reverse in the future. So, I covered this company in FSA, Pioneer Resources, contracts out over a 5-year span, they're fracking or drilling. And they say, look, we're going to spend roughly $1 billion each year in fracking, or in drilling. If they decide, in December, they're not going to drill as much as they should, well, in the future, they're going to need to make up for that. So presumably, that's going to have an effect on future sales, and it's going to have an effect on higher future expenses. So there's going to be this joint effect on future earnings because of the real earnings management. All right, so let me just jump ahead. So this is sort of kind of what, I think hopefully this will be one to close on. So what we look at here is we look at all firms over like a 30-year span, I think, that reported really small annual earnings increases. So if you will, it's roughly, I think, $25 million or less, 1.5% of assets or less. So positive earnings increases on an annual basis. The suspect firms are those firms that report these small annual increases, but they have negative sales growth. The control firms are able to do it via with positive sales increases. Okay, and so what we're going to assert is that these firms that that report higher earnings on negative sales growth, we suspect they might be managing earnings. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to take the variances and covariances of the control firms, and and that's what's given up top. So if you will, that's what's up here. These are sort of the sample beta estimates. And then what we're going to do is we're going to vary gamma, we're going to vary sigma epsilon, we're going to vary lambda, and we're going to vary, is it permanent or temporary? We're going to vary these parameters. And what we're going to see is, do the synthetic slopes that we compute here. So like right here, I've got 0.252. How does that compare to the control firm ones? Okay. And what we want to be able to say is, can we explain the observed slopes that we see? How do they compare to the synthetic slopes? And what these shaded in cells represent are synthetic slopes for each of these 5 regressions. Now note, these 5 regressions, these slopes, change in revenue minus change in expense equals change in net income. Change in cash flow plus change in accruals equals, keep going to the wrong window. Change in revenue plus or minus change in expenses equals change in net income. Change in cash flow plus change in accrual, the slopes on those must equal change in net income. If, using the additive nature of accounting, if we can explain all 5 slopes, and if all 5 slopes are within 2 standard errors of the observed slopes, which is what we have right here, what we would say is that in this setting, with these parameters, this would be consistent. We can't rule out earnings management. Okay? And what you'll notice here is that, we can't explain it with all accrual, we can't explain it with all real, but we can explain it with a combination of the two. When earnings management, the economic significance of it is 0.16. All right, now there is a cool part to this, I think. So what we're saying is, this might be the raised point. Like, look, 0.016 is just too big. It's economically implausible that firms are going to manage accruals by that amount. Okay, true. Okay, but a combination of the two can explain it. And let's think of what the sigma epsilon represents. This represents, the combination, the linear combination of accrual manipulation, real earnings management, and then the covariance of the combined strategy, right? I know this is a bit nerdy, but I think this is sort of cool. If you assume firms are they're going to their strategies, their real management and their accrual-based management are positively correlated, perfectly positively correlated. We can back out what the real earnings management and what the accrual-based management must be. And what you'll see is it's significantly lower than what's implied up here. Okay. And so now we can have discussions whether, does it make sense that the average annual or accrual-based earnings management is, 0.7% of assets, not 1% of assets, but 0.7% of assets. And because these are volatilities, these are, it's basically implying just a small percentage of firms are managing earnings over 1%. We can have these discussions and notice that everything's constrained. If they're going to manage by this much accrual base, this is what the implied real must be. Okay. And again, to Sudiptu's point, I guess we have to assume some of this stuff reverses over one period, but we can easily add in multi-period reversals. Okay. We have to assume that these things aren't asymmetric, but we think the math would be pretty simple, or at least tractable if you wanted to add in interactions in there for asymmetric reversals. Okay, but kind of what we're trying to do is, if earnings management exists, it needs to explain all these other slopes too, and has to be parameterized by this model. So I'm out of time. I want to be respectful. We do this on a quarterly basis. But kind of what we think we can do is sort of tie together, perhaps what's been asserted in the survey literature and in the vast majority of our empirical literature, and address Ray Ball's concern that economic plausibility is sort of it just doesn't exist there. But if we assume that they're doing both at the same time, some of this possibly can be explained. All right, so thank you. I do want to get off and let those that have been so respectful of my time, I want to be respectful of yours. So thank you for the comments. This has been really helpful.
Thank you, Bob.